In this video, we will be looking at ventricles of the brain and cerebrospinal fluid, also known as CSF. So inside the brain, there are 4 internal cavities, and these cavities are called as ventricles. So essentially, the meaning of the word ventricle is cavity or a chamber. And since there is a cavity or a chamber, it needs to be filled with some fluid. So in case of ventricles of the brain, it contains cerebrospinal fluid. Now these 4 cavities or the ventricles are connected by openings or channels. So in total, there are 4 ventricles, 2 lateral ventricle, 1 third ventricle and 1 fourth ventricle. So the 2 lateral ventricles, one each is located inside the cerebral hemisphere. You remember our cerebrum is divided into 2 cerebral hemispheres. So each hemisphere contains 1 lateral ventricle. And the 2 lateral ventricles are connected to each other through the interventricular foramen. Next to that, there is another ventricle in the diencephalon called as third ventricle, and just posterior to pons there is fourth ventricle. So in total there are 4 ventricles, 2 lateral ventricle, third ventricle of diencephalon and fourth ventricle posterior to the pons. Now the third ventricle connects to fourth ventricle via cerebral aqueduct. We looked at cerebral aqueduct when we were studying midbrain. Fourth ventricle continues as central canal in the spinal cord. So as you can see in this diagram, there are 2 views. Section A shows you lateral view and section B shows you anterior view. Let's see the lateral view first. You can see the 2 side-by-side lateral ventricles, and below the lateral ventricle is the third ventricle. Below the third ventricle is the fourth ventricle. The lateral ventricles are connected to each other by interventricular foramen. Third ventricle is connected to the fourth ventricle by cerebral aqueduct. Let's see the same structures through the anterior view. These 2 are lateral ventricles. You can see one on right and one on left. In between the 2 lateral ventricles, there is interventricular foramen. So this interventricular foramen connects the 2 lateral ventricles to each other as well as to the third ventricle. So this is third ventricle, which connects to fourth ventricle via cerebral aqueduct. And fourth ventricle, as you can see, is diamond shape, and that continues as central canal. So this is central canal of the spinal cord. So these ventricles are filled with clear watery fluid called as cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF for short. So the amount of this cerebrospinal fluid in central nervous system is about 150 milliliters, and it circulates through the subarachnoid space. You will remember subarachnoid space from the video of meninges. So subarachnoid space is the space between arachnoid matter and pia matter. So the CSF is located in the subarachnoid space. Let's see the production, circulation and absorption of CSF. CSF is produced at choroid plexus of the ventricles. Now these choroid plexus are the network of ependymal cells and capillaries. Ependymal cells are part of neuroglia cells. So I have mentioned about ependymal cells under neuroglia video. So these cells and the capillaries they produce cerebrospinal fluid. From the choroid plexus, where the cerebrospinal fluid is produced, it circulates into the two lateral ventricles, and from there it moves to third ventricle via interventricular foramen. From the third ventricle, the cerebrospinal fluid will go to fourth ventricle via cerebral aqueduct. The cerebrospinal fluid will exit the ventricles through three apertures. So the meaning of the apertures is opening. So there are three openings that will allow the passage of CSF, one median aperture and two lateral apertures. From there, the fluid will flow around the brain and to the spinal cord in the subarachnoid space. So it goes down through the central canal as well. So let's look at circulation of cerebrospinal fluid. So you can see in this diagram, number 1 shows you the choroid plexus, which is the network of ependymal cells and capillaries. So in total, there are 4 choroid plexus, 1 for each ventricle. In this diagram, you can clearly see the choroid plexus for one of the lateral ventricle because it is a sagittal section. Choroid plexus for third ventricle and choroid plexus for fourth ventricle. So each ventricle has a choroid plexus where the CSF production will take place. The CSF circulates from the lateral ventricle to the third ventricle through the interventricular foramen. From the third ventricle, it goes to the fourth ventricle through cerebral aqueduct. From the fourth ventricle, the CSF reaches subarachnoid space through one median and two lateral apertures, and the CSF also flows through the subarachnoid space of the spinal cord and the central canal. So let's see the reabsorption of the CSF. So all this fluid that is circulating has to be reabsorbed back. So the reabsorption takes place at arachnoid granulations, and these granulations are finger-like projections along the arachnoid matter. And from here, the CSF gets reabsorbed into the dural sinus, and from dural sinuses it is sent to the venous circulation. So in this diagram, you can see the arachnoid granulations, which are finger-like projections along the arachnoid matter. In this particular diagram, you can see superior sagittal sinus. So all the CSF will go to superior sagittal sinus, and from there it will be sent back to venous circulation. So let's see the functions of the CSF. Now, brain is floating in CSF, and hence it supports the brain and it cushions the brain and all the delicate neural structures that are associated with the brain. So since brain is floating in this fluid, it actually acts like a shock absorbent. CSF also maintains the chemical stability, and it removes the waste products from the central nervous system through the blood-brain barrier. Now just a couple of clinical notes. Usually the rate of production of CSF and rate of reabsorption of CSF matches. But in case if the reabsorption is less compared to the production, then there is a constant accumulation of CSF in the brain. This condition is called as hydrocephalus. Another reason why this can happen is because there is obstruction to the flow of CSF, and that also causes hydrocephalus. Lumbar puncture is a puncture made at subarachnoid space between L3 and L4 to collect the cerebrospinal fluid. Now normally this sampling of CSF is done for clinical information about infections, example meningitis. Also the spinal tap is done to administer spinal anesthesia. Thank you for watching this video.